Welcome to The Explainer. In the world of law, some of the most interesting questions aren't about what happened, but why. So today, we're diving deep into criminal defenses. These are the legal arguments that can completely flip a case on its head and really challenge how we define guilt.
So let's just ask it straight up. When is a crime not actually a crime? What kind of circumstances could possibly make an act that looks totally illegal completely lawful in the eyes of the court? Well, the answer gets right to the very heart of what we think of as justice.
Okay, so before we can really get how a defense works, we need to understand what the prosecution has to prove to even get a conviction in the first place. And it all boils down to two key ingredients. Think of it kind of like a recipe for a crime. First, you need the actus reus. That's the Latin for the physical, wrongful act. And second, you need the mens rea, the guilty mind or the criminal intent behind the act. The prosecution has to prove both of these things beyond a reasonable doubt. If they can't, there's no conviction. And that is exactly where legal defenses come into play. Every single defense, no matter what it is basically an argument designed to show that at least one of these ingredients is missing. It's all about attacking the prosecution's case by saying, hey, either the act wasn't what you think it was, or the intention just wasn't there. So let's start with defenses that go after that guilty mind. These are the cases where the person pretty much admits they did the act, but they argue they didn't have the criminal intent, often because of a simple, honest mistake. Okay, imagine you leaving a coffee shop and you grab a phone off the table that looks exactly like yours. You genuinely 100% believed it was your phone. So even though you took someone else's property, that's the actus reus, you didn't have the intent to steal. That's a classic mistake of fact, and it totally cancels out the guilty mind. But what happens when it's not just a simple mistake? What if the issue is a person's entire mental state at the time of the act? This brings us to one of the most complex and, honestly, most misunderstood ideas in all of criminal law: the defense of mental disorder. For someone to be found not criminally responsible by reason of mental disorder, or NCRMD for short, the law has this really strict two-part test. First, it has to be proven that the person had a mental disorder in the legal sense of the term. And second, it has to be shown that because of that disorder, they were literally incapable of understanding what they were doing, or they were incapable of knowing that what they were doing was morally wrong. And this is so important because it totally busts a huge myth you see in movies all the time. An NCRMD verdict is not a get-out-of-jail-free card, not even close. An acquittal means you're found not guilty and you walk free. But an NCRMD finding, that means you're placed under the authority of a review board, and you are only released if and when they decide you're no longer a threat to public safety. All right, what about a temporary state that messes with your mind? Not from a disorder, but from intoxication. We've all heard somebody say it, right? I was so drunk I didn't even know what I was doing. But does that argument actually fly in a courtroom? Well, the law is very, very specific here. Just being mildly intoxicated, that's a big fat 0% defense. If you're really drunk, it might work as a partial defense for crimes that require some complex thought, what the law calls specific intent, like murder. It could maybe knock a murder charge down to manslaughter. But for a full defense, the intoxication has to be so extreme that it's basically a state of automatism, where your mind has zero control over your body. And the legal standard for that is incredibly high. This isn't about being blackout drunk and not remembering what you did the next day. This means a complete loss of any voluntary control at the time of the act. It's a state that's extremely rare and, you can imagine, very, very difficult to prove. Now, let's switch gears. Let's move to a concept that isn't about the defendant's state of mind, but about the victim's consent. In cases of assault, and especially sexual assault, the legal definition of consent has changed dramatically. Yeah, that old way of thinking, the idea that consent is there as long as nobody says no, in the eyes of the law, that is completely and totally outdated. Today, Canadian law is crystal clear. Consent isn't about the absence of a no. It's about the presence of a positive, voluntary, and enthusiastic yes. It's a huge shift from no means no to only yes means yes. As you can see, the legal definition gets very precise. Consent has to be a voluntary agreement to the specific sexual activity that's happening. And crucially, it has to be there at the time of the activity, and it can be taken back at any moment. This means there's no such thing as implied consent or giving your consent ahead of time.
A landmark Supreme Court case just nails this point home. The court ruled that if someone agrees to have sex with a condom, that consent is gone the second the condom is removed or not used. Why? Because it fundamentally changes the nature of the act, and so it requires a brand new, specific agreement.
Okay, so up to this point, we've mostly been looking at defenses that are kind of like excuses. They attack the whole guilty mind idea. Now we're shifting to something different called justifications. These are defenses where the person fully intended to do what they did, but they argue they were right to do it. And this is a really, really crucial distinction. With a justification, the defense isn't saying, I didn't mean to do it. It's saying, you're damn right I meant to do it, and I was right to do it. The law basically allows for a reasonable response when you believe you're under threat.
So, the law looks at three key things to decide if something was really self-defense. First, the catalyst. Did the person reasonably believe they were in danger? Second, the motive. Was their action really about protecting themselves? And finally, the response. Was the force they used reasonable and proportional to the threat they were facing?
So, after diving into all these different kinds of defenses, let's circle all the way back to our original question and pull this all together. Why do these concepts even exist? Are they just loopholes? This quote right here really gets to the heart of it. Defenses are not just technicalities or some kind of legal trick. They are fundamental safety mechanisms that are built right into our justice system. They exist to make sure that the full weight of the criminal law is saved for people who are actually at fault, people who are morally blameworthy. It's how our legal system tries to line up with our basic human sense of fairness. And all this leaves us with a final, pretty big thought. These lines are not always clear, you know? The law is always changing as it tries to balance a person's rights with public safety. And it leaves us asking, where should we as a society draw the line between an action we excuse and an action we justify? And what does that choice say about the values we all share?